Good evening. My name is Michael Cowan. In my capacity as the current president of this campus's Emeriti Association, I want to welcome you to this evening's lecture by my longtime colleague and friend, Edmund Burke III, research professor of modern Middle Eastern and world history. For the past 11 years, our association, with the generous support of the Chancellor's Office, has periodically sponsored public lectures by distinguished emeriti on topics of broad interest and importance. In today's internet-saturated world, we are constantly being reminded of the complex ways in which a tsunami in Japan, or violent strife in Syria, or conflict in the Ukraine, or nuclear tests in North Korea, or the ascension of a new pope, or the death of a revered South African leader can set off shock waves that ripple far beyond the borders of particular nation states. Terry Burke is here tonight in part to remind us that such shock waves have been transcending local, national, and regional boundaries since long before the days of near-instant electronic communication. For his nearly 5 decades as a professional historian, and well before his arrival at UCSC in 1969, Terry has been on an adventurous journey into the world, a journey both as scholar and teacher to understand the world and the complex relations of its myriad larger and smaller parts. His journey has taken him on research and teaching expeditions to France, England, Italy, Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Turkey, Tunisia, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon, Hong Kong, Macau, Malaysia, Indonesia, India, Australia, to name a few. It has taken him to a huge number of professional conferences and university colloquia here and abroad, where he has delivered over 200 papers to diverse audiences. His global forays have been fueled by virtually every major national fellowship and granting agency that one can think of, and have brought him to such prestigious think tanks as the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton and the European University Institute in Florence. His journeys have, of course, been of the mind as well as of the body. To paraphrase Henry David Thoreau, Terry has also traveled far while staying in Santa Cruz. He's returned from his long, long hours on those inner explorations, loaded down with the many books that he's authored, edited, and co-edited, and with dozens and dozens of essays he's written. A prodigious output that has made him an internationally prominent scholar, not only of Middle Eastern and North African history, and of the complex ideological phenomenon known as Orientalism, but of the increasingly important and influential fields of environmental history and world history. His most recent book, The Ethnographic State, France, and the Invention of Moroccan Islam, which will appear this fall from the University of California Press, is only the latest souvenir from his extraordinarily productive intellectual travels. Terry's multidimensional journeys have centrally involved a quest for what, in his splendidly provocative introduction to a 2008 collection of essays, he calls the big story, a story involving 3,500 years of human history. His goal, he notes, is to examine the environmental consequences of human development over the very long term, as a way of providing a different perspective on the environmental quandary we currently face as a species. I want, he states, to examine the deep history of human history, energy regimes, and the environment. A wonderful phrase, deep history. Terry's reach is both broad and deep, and that depth includes attention to forces and processes that lie below the surface of passing phenomena, Thus, in a 2008 essay, he can speak of his quest to understand what he calls the hidden history of the Mediterranean at the end of the 18th century. In a revealingly titled 2012 essay, Toward a Deep Cultural History of the Mediterranean, he argues that the deep cultural shifts of the period can be described as a kind of historic plate tectonics. It is no stretch for us to think of Terry's own work as a wonderfully provocative historical geology. But in his quest for the big story, Terry never lets us forget that the big story is constituted by an extraordinary number and variety of what one might call little stories with big implications. Among the many examples in his work that I could cite, let me merely mention his 1993 book, Struggle and Survival in the Modern Middle East, which was republished in a revised, expanded edition in 2006. This stimulating collection of several dozen biographical essays on ordinary Middle Eastern men and women challenges a deterministic view of history that portrays Middle Easterners, in Terry's words, as marionettes in an historical drama not of their devising, rather than as flesh and blood individuals with some capacity to affect their own life chances. As Terry puts it, because real lives sprawl in their sheer exuberance across conventional categories, the patterns of individual lives elude even the best theories. The more accounts of lives we have, the better we will be able to assess their typicality and to understand individual survival strategies. By their sheer variety, he asserts, the lives presented in this book constitute a potent antidote to the homogenizing and essentialist impulse. While continually demonstrating his profound respect for the power of the particular, of particular lives, groups, individual events, and places, Terry never loses sight of his goal of linking such important particularities to more general structures, to, as he says, abstract from the dense thicket of local specificities, some basic patterns. One of the most important of the many remarkable aspects of Terry's career has been his passion for and skill at identifying patterns and at making meaningful connections. In addition to building sturdy bridges between a close attention to the particular and a concern with general process and forces, and between linking fine-grained empirical research and searching self-critical theory, Terry's connection-making has involved reaching across traditional disciplinary boundaries. He has showed himself, of course, a master of the various branches of historical investigation, including historiography and theories of history. But he has also reached out and incorporated into his work the research, perspectives, and theorizing of fields as various as anthropology, sociology, and environmental sciences, not to mention, quite strikingly, postmodern literary and linguistic analysis and theory. Equally important for Terry as linking interdisciplinary fields has been his linking of people. Both kinds of linking, in fact, he has often argued, depend intimately on each other. In his classrooms, where Terry tells me he has often gotten his best ideas, in conferences and workshops he's organized, and in myriad informal conversations with students and colleagues, Terry has worked creatively to facilitate the ability of people to talk to each other across the borders of different fields and of different and even conflicting perspectives. Among his most important contributions to the intellectual life of this campus has been his vigorous and creative leadership of several research centers, most recently as director for the past decade of UCSC's Center for World History. Countless students and faculty from this campus and farther afield, including many international scholars, have benefited immensely from his conversation facilitating efforts, both in and outside his own classrooms. I would be remiss not to mention one more kind of linking effort in which Terry has played a key role: his central involvement in several consortial partnerships with leading scholars from other universities in making accessible to teachers in college and secondary public schools throughout the US and abroad, in online and in print form, the important findings of current world history research. One important outcome of such work is his co-authored volume with the modest title, World History: The Big Eras, a compact history of humankind for teachers and students, which is already in its second edition. Terry, thus, has been not merely a practitioner of, but a wide-ranging evangelist on behalf of world history. But his evangelism is always on behalf of opening up people to asking questions. A 2001 essay characteristically asserts, we can start with questions. A great advantage of cross-disciplinary interactions, he points out in the 2012 essay, is that, to quote him, where a particular disciplinary or regional literature leaves off, others can intervene to provide new questions. Terry stresses that the questions we ask profoundly affect the answers we get. His work thus critiques the limited questions that many scholars and others have asked. Ones, for example, that limits one's focus to a particular nation state, or assume that categories such as Islamic or Middle Eastern or modern refer to monolithic entities. One of Terry's major and most productive strategies as a scholar and teacher has been to keep asking new questions, lots of different kinds of questions, to see what kinds of answers each question generates, to compare those answers and to use such comparisons as the basis to ask additional questions. Terry has constantly stressed that expertise in world history doesn't involve knowing everything about the world. Rather, it's a perspective on the world. It involves asking good questions. More specifically, it involves asking specific questions, useful questions, about how specific lives, groups, institutions, events, and ideas, specific nations and regions are embedded in and can be understood within a global context that transcends limited temporal or spatial boundaries. And at the same time, asking useful questions about how those specificities cumulatively have themselves constituted and affected that larger entity, both a materiality and an abstraction, that we call the world. I'm confident that Terry will be proposing some challenging questions for us tonight, but I suspect that he'll also be offering us some tentative answers to some of those questions. Answers that I'm sure will stimulate us to ask more questions, both of him and of ourselves. Please join me in welcoming and in honoring Professor Emeritus Terry Burke.
That was overwhelming. That was amazing. Well, good evening. That was absolutely overwhelming. And I kept thinking he must be talking about someone else, because clearly it couldn't be me. Thank you so much, Michael. I mean, Michael and I go all the way back to the beginning days in Merrill, so there's much interactions over the years, and I'm really very grateful to him for having been the one to introduce me here. I would like to thank the Emeriti as well, and the campus chancellors, deans, et cetera, who have facilitated the development of my career here. I think this has really proved to be a wonderful place for me to be. And it didn't necessarily seem promising when I first came here, thinking in narrow sort of career terms, but actually in so many ways it just pushed me beyond anything that I could ever have imagined. And so really the thoughts and thought processes that are described by Michael so eloquently, and hopefully this lecture I'm about to give as well will show in detail as well as in bigger touches just how indebted I am to the community of scholars and teachers and students above all, upon whom I have experimented sometimes haplessly with various different formulations that were clearly half-baked. So whether the thing is ready to come out of the oven yet or not, I will leave to you to decide. Okay, so I wanted to just make one explanation of the music. When you came in, there was a bunch of music playing, and depending on when you came in, you might have heard two pieces or you might have heard only one. And so I need to make a brief sort of aside here and say that one of my practices over the last at least 20 years of teaching here is, particularly my lecture classes, I like to have what I call walk-in music to get people in the mood and to get them thinking about, well, where it is exactly, what particular historical voyage we're going to go on today. And so composing a playlist for Mediterranean history, as you can imagine, is just an irresistible excuse to spend endless hours on YouTube trying to find just the right morsel to dangle in front of you. So anyway, tonight, the first one I played is by a Spanish and Moroccan group, which is called Radio Tarifa. Tarifa is the Arabic for the strait being the Straits of Gibraltar. And it's an attempt on the part of Spanish musicians of various different backgrounds, including North African, to create a kind of a human bridge and sort of update on the culture that once was that linked the two back in the days before continental drift asserted itself and nations rose above the surface of the waves and old empires disappeared. This is one that is their riff on a Sephardic Ladino tune. Right, so that's the first one, and the group is Radio Tarifa. You can find it on your YouTube readily. And the other one is one of my all-time favorites, and it's by the incomparable Cheb Khaled. Some of you may know his work. If not, this is a remarkable Algerian singer, son of a famous Algerian novelist of colonial times, who decided to take his talents in a somewhat different direction. And the tune is called Bab el Wad Kingston. It's a kind of a mashup of Rai, which is the sort of popular music of Algeria of the time in this case being in the late 1990s, I think, and of reggae, right? So Bab el Wad is the popular quarter in Algiers, memorialized in a way that maybe you'd be surprised in the film The Battle of Algiers. Let's just take a census. How many of you have seen that film? Oh, good going. All right. I am among friends. And so clearly, if you haven't seen it, you must rush off and do it, because it is a really remarkable film, one of the very first sort of films to bring the Third World Revolution to American and international audiences. And Bab el Wad is the quarter at that time, that we're talking the early 1950s, when it was inhabited by a mixture of, on the one hand, Algerian Muslims, and on the other hand, working class French and sort of Mediterranean European people. And it is there that the paratroopers ended up hanging out because they liked the local ladies. So it became a right-wing citadel. So in the midst of the struggles, the convulsive struggles of the liberation of French Algeria, Bab el Wad figures in that respect, but it also was very much a Muslim quarter and subsequently was reclaimed after independence and has become a continually changing sort of barometer of what's going on in Algerian society. So Bab el Wad and Kingston, Jamaica, is the reference, right? So those two go together. Depending on how long you want to stick around afterwards and how long it takes me to read my text, I have some other tunes I'd be delighted to play as well. So thank you all for coming. And what I want to do now is to sort of take you on a trip, which is a mental trip. Some of the best trips, I think, are mental trips. It doesn't involve having to cross time zones. You don't have to go through interrogation procedures at airports. There's any number of things to be said for making mental trips, although real trips are also, needless to say, delicious and much to be preferred in all sorts of other respects. I'm going to have to make an adjustment here because somehow, can I do this? My screen has moved the way it was not supposed to. What happened? Nope. Okay, so guys, okay, here we are. So actually, no. So we keep going. There we are. All right. So you have been staring at a map of the Mediterranean, needless to say, and I think it's a rather good one. It's a satellite image. And so it doesn't give us boundaries, but it does give us sort of ecology, and particularly it gives us a really rich sense of the importance of mountains in separating, dividing, and sort of surrounding the peoples of the Mediterranean. These have played a crucial role all through Mediterranean history, and therein hangs a tale, and mostly I'm not going to be able to tell that tale tonight. Just in case you didn't know where you were, here's where you are. And so I next have to say that the images that are going to come up have no particular relationship to the text. So it's not an attempt to be postmodern, but I just thought if I was going to have PowerPoint, perhaps it would be nice if there was something to look at. And so it's predominantly on sort of the physical and human geography of the Mediterranean, and maybe a few little other bits. So I am not going to look at it because it's only going to distract me, but you certainly are fully able to do that. All right, so let me carry on here. And the first thing I want to do is to point out a couple of tweaks in the title, which has gotten a little punchier maybe, and it's now called What Went Wrong? The Muslim Mediterranean in Modern Times, Historical Contexts and Conjunctures. Okay, so the basic scenario is that there's something wrong with the Mediterranean in general, and is particularly wrong with the Muslim bits. And probably, at least in the case of the Muslim Mediterranean, it has a one-word answer, and that one word is Islam. And so in many respects, this talk is one that is aimed at trying to maybe unsettle some of the ways in which we so naturally fall into it, a civilizational understanding at a point when such things really are quite archaic and need to be retired to the nearest library. It's also part, so I have to make one more liaison. This is going to go on forever if I do much more of this, but let me just make one more comment, because when I came here, I was teaching French history and Middle East history, and I used textbooks for both. After a bit, I stopped using the textbooks for the French altogether, and I continued to use the ones for the Mediterranean because the political chronology is so intricate that without it, it's very hard to follow the story. But I always hated the way in which these textbooks were constraining, most of all because they purported to provide some kind of synthesization of just exactly what it was that happened. They gave you the quintessence of what it all was. And the problem was that if you actually knew anybody who lived in the Middle East, you would know immediately that this is actually not a very good way of trying to understand things. And so the book that I put out that Michael mentioned, which is called Struggle and Survival in the Modern Middle East, is an effort to try and get students, was really intended all along as an effort to get students to think outside the box of the textbook and to confront human narratives of people who zigged when they should have zagged with the actual realities on the ground and what the textbook author thought actually happened. All right, so it's in this spirit, but minus the people, that this talk takes place. So, cautionary note. So, for some time it's become apparent that history is melting. In response to a conceptual global warming, previously stable historical categories of space and time have become inundated. Nation-state history and political time, while they inform much of the history teaching in our classrooms, are threatened at the research level by the rising tide of other approaches. For those attached to the notion of history as the biography of the nation state, this conceptual inundation has been disconcerting. The end of colonialism and the growing awareness of the economic and cultural interconnectedness of peoples has set off a kind of intellectual Copernican revolution in the way in which we think about the world. This has led to an expansion in the temporal scale at which history is written. In place of older historical narratives that placed Europe at the center and viewed it as the motor of world history, scholars have begun to rethink Europe's moment of political dominance. A world historical perspective can enrich our understanding of how we humans have been mixed up in one another's lives for a very long time and point to the fundamental unity of humankind. As historians have begun to think beyond the nation-state and the civilization, they have been exploring the previously neglected modern and pre-modern histories of Africa, Asia, America, and Oceania. Until now, the Mediterranean has stood outside the conversations prompted by the New World history. Instead, its history has been written in a civilizational key, with the main determinants its inbuilt cultural motors, rather than its Mediterranean historical legacy. Now, by training, I'm an historian of modern Europe and the Middle East, and I have written extensively on Arab social movements, French Orientalism, and world, especially recently, environmental history. So I bring a long experience in linking intensely local with the global. For the last decade, I have been actively seeking ways to link the history of the Mediterranean region to the experience of the rest of the world. So my talk this evening is an effort to reimagine and thereby to rehistoricize the ways in which we think about the modern Mediterranean by locating it in its regional and global context. And I'll explain what I mean in a second. Such an effort is necessary if we are to transcend the civilizational narratives that frame the ways in which we understand Muslims and the Middle East. If we examine the history of the Muslim Mediterranean in the context of the fate of the Mediterranean region as a whole, over the period that historians call the long 19th century, that is to say the period from 1750 to 1914, we can see that that culture provides only a partial and reductive explanation of the historical changes it has undergone. This enables us to open a space for large-scale historical comparisons across the Middle East and Arab North Africa. As a comparative historian of modern French and Arab history who has been teaching world history for 3 decades, I've long been aware of the need for such a history. So there's lurking here is the sort of the unwritten comparative history of the Arab peoples. If we understand that the Muslim Mediterranean's path to modernity, so there's not just Arabs in play here, was in many crucial ways similar to the path taken by Spain, Italy, and Greece, perhaps we'll be less quick to impose cultural explanations upon present-day Middle Eastern and Islamic societies, at the expense, perhaps, of other types of historical thinking. To be sure, the standard civilizational narrative is seductive, linking as it does the Crusades, the Reconquista, the Ottoman Habsburg Wars of the 16th century, and the experience of colonialism. But, as I will suggest, the clash of civilizations thesis both drastically distorts the way we understand this history and risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy in a Europe that is awash in Islamophobia. The intellectual and political stakes are therefore high, and we are well advised not to further the effort in the direction of bad history and bad politics. It's time for a different approach. Because the modern Mediterranean is not included in most history curricula, students lack the ability to understand its history. As a consequence, this crucially important world region remains misunderstood, and civilizational explanations have tended to supplant more grounded world historical undertakings. While the civilizational model makes great ideology, it is poor history. Today, the modern Mediterranean, as a result, events appear to come out of nowhere, and civilizational explanations have tended to supplant more grounded world historical understandings, and an important world region remains misunderstood. So my talk then is an effort to rethink the place of regional histories in world history using the Mediterranean as a case study. So one thing I'm trying to do is to actually think about world history and the place of regions in that. And then, in addition, against the background of the British and French models of modernity, the Mediterranean appears as a kind of space of difference. In comparative historical perspective, the region appears as politically shaped by the institutions and discourses of French modernity, while economically the Mediterranean took its own path to industrialization, two discoveries that have only recently seen the light of day. A comparative history of how Mediterranean societies came to modernity makes it possible to relocate the experience of colonialism in the Mediterranean within the larger story of the hegemony of Northwestern Europe over the region as a whole. In this context, we can ask, how much did it matter that some states in the Mediterranean were colonizers and some were colonized? Only a global framing of the process by which the Mediterranean came to modernity can help us to get past the civilizational and nationalist framings of the history of the region. Why does this matter? It matters because it can be shown, if it can be shown, that Mediterranean societies had broadly similar experiences with the forces that made the modern world, incorporation in the world market, state formation, nationalism, and all the rest. Might this help us to think about their past, presents, and futures? By locating the Mediterranean in its long-term multiple historical and eco-historical context, I suggest we may better understand the dilemmas it has faced by the challenge of modernity. Putting the Mediterranean into world history. So let's begin by locating the Mediterranean in a global eco-historical perspective. Excuse me, wow. I have been warned. I say eco-historical because it is the ecological givens of the Mediterranean that have most profoundly shaped its unity within diversity. This was the main point of Ferdinand Brodel's magisterial, The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II, which ranks as one of the most famous, least read books in his enormous oeuvre. So often referred to, but rarely read. Now, Brodel is then writing at a point of the 16th century. The age of Philip II is the age of the golden age of Spain. What I want to do is to say, okay, so Brodel is saying that ecology is crucially important in shaping the Mediterranean. As we'll see in a minute, I think he leaves some things out and leaves us kind of stuck. However, if we think in deeper historical ways about the region, one of the things that really comes to the fore, and I wasn't actually quite prepared for this, is that the agricultural fertility of the Mediterranean and the Fertile Crescent made it a demographic and political behemoth as well as the cradle of civilizations. So for instance, as late as 600 CE, and we start our clock here in 1500 BCE, so as late as 600 CE, more than 1/3 of all humans resided around the shores of the Mediterranean. So that, consider that, right? And actually the earlier numbers are bigger, right? The proportion of people who lived in the Mediterranean region, including in a more generous way the Middle East, is way bigger than anything going on in China or India, just to pick two other potential sites of comparison. After 1000 CE, the Mediterranean begins a long decline from its classical demographic height, as its agricultural base was now undermined by millennia of ecological neglect, became less and less capable of supporting large populations. The long-term agricultural and demographic decline of the region was more gradual and began much earlier than we sometimes think. That's the main point here. But by 1500, things had flipped around, and so the Mediterranean now actually has a smaller population, Mediterranean, including the Middle East, had a smaller population than China all by itself. Right? And then I have other numbers that I will bring up a little bit later on. All right, so if we're just thinking Middle East, Europe, China, India as our comparisons, the Mediterranean is, in ancient times, is a dynamo. And the base of all of that is that so many people live there. So but a second thing also comes into play, and that is the place of the Mediterranean in the circuits of global exchange. Now, in ancient times, this had been central. But as we move into the 16th century, things begin to change. And as a result of the so-called voyages of discovery, a new center of the world economy emerges, first in South Asia, the Indian Ocean world, and then by the end of the 16th century, the rise of the Atlantic world as two new centers of the world economy. So already by 1550, the North Atlantic sailing ships are intruding into the Mediterranean, challenging the long dominant naval powers, Genoa and Venice, which remained very much devoted to the technology that was galley warfare. So warfare on sea in the Mediterranean well into the 16th century, indeed right up into the early 17th century, continues to be primarily via galleys, which is pretty amazing. With its two most profitable agro-industries, sugar and cotton, relocated to the Americas, this happens as a result of these global circuits of exchange being transformed, and its monetary system swamped by the silver of the Americas and by African gold, the Mediterranean assumes a much reduced economic role. All right, so just to give a quick replay on that. So part of what I'm arguing then is that because of the rise of these new other centers, the Indian Ocean world and increasingly the Atlantic world, the Mediterranean gradually just begins to fall out of the mix. While the spice trade continues at the same levels, going through the Mediterranean, coming from the Indian Ocean world, the actual volumes increase enormously. So the volume is the sort of a constantly expanding pie, of which the share of the Mediterranean is increasingly declining, even though its actual totals remain more or less constant. That's the argument I'm making. A third event also helps to propel the Mediterranean away from being a place of economic dominance and demographic importance, and that is, roll the drums please, the Little Ice Age. Right? So the Little Ice Age is a major climatic event that happened over the period from 1300 to 1850. The historian Jeffrey Parker has just written a 950-page book on the subject of the Little Ice Age if you want to know more. But it dramatically affected the Mediterranean world, mostly in ways that have not yet been charted. Right? So we know a lot about the impact of the Little Ice Age on the North Atlantic, on the impact of the Little Ice Age on continental Europe, on Japan, and to some extent now increasingly on China as well, but much less so about the Mediterranean. And the result, the way it manifested itself in the Mediterranean is in a sequence of torrential rains that sweep away pre-existing irrigation works, swamp coastlines, and force coastal populations to relocate to the interior hills. And this then has the further knock-on effect of accelerating the overall agricultural and demographic decline. Again, left out of this account, but we could retrofit it if you'd like, is the Black Death, which also has a very important role in pushing populations down. And the recovery from that is extremely gradual, and why it's gradual has a lot to do with the Little Ice Age. All right, finally, there's a fourth factor that I want to point to here. So we're talking about the larger global eco-historical dimensions of where does the Mediterranean fit in vis-a-vis other regions. And this has to do with the increasing energetic vulnerability of the Mediterranean region as a whole. So what does this mean? Well, already wood poor by early modern times, the Mediterranean was cruelly lacking in coal resources. So as a result, the Mediterranean had to sit out the first round of the fossil fuel revolution. By the time it reached phase 2, the age of petroleum and natural gas, these resources were not in its care to be able to dispose of as they chose. Right, so in some ways, one could say, somewhat polemically, I'm not sure how far I want to go with this, that if you want to understand the different path towards economic modernity of the Mediterranean, we have a one-word answer, or maybe it's a two-word answer: no coal. Right? Because so if the Mediterranean has no coal, and Europe, the rest of Europe, Northern Europe, has coal, then the Mediterranean is at a huge disadvantage. It must import its coal at hideous expense from elsewhere. All right, and the destruction of ancient forests, which is something that goes way back into the mists of time, is another factor. So the Mediterranean wood is, of course, crucial not only as a fuel, but also as a building material, and as a building material for ships. So the Mediterranean is not as advantaged as, say, China, which has lots of internal resources, lots of wood resources it can exploit. India, pretty much the same way. Northern Europe, which has got a similar wood dilemma, in fact, even more accelerated wood dilemma, has the wonderful discovery that Mother Nature has endowed it with coal. And not only is it endowed it with coal, but that coal is located near water. And so you could move it to where the iron is and vice versa. And so India has coal, as it turns out. So does China. But neither of them have coal in places where you can move it around by water. So the burden of all of this is that we don't need to seek cultural explanations for the decline of the Mediterranean region after 1550. All the will in the world and all the good capitalist intentions could not compensate for centuries of demographic decline, agricultural downturn, and deforestation. Nor could Mediterranean elites compensate for the changed position of the Mediterranean in the circuits of global exchange. Nothing could make up for the fact that when Mother Nature was distributing her goodies, the Mediterranean came up short in the coal department. Because it lacked both ecological resources and the strategic position to make the transition to new historical context of the age of fossil fuels, the Mediterranean was one of the big regional losers in the post-1500 world. As a result, it slipped from core to semi-peripheral status in the world economy. The recounting of this history necessarily leads to a reassessment of the role of culture in shaping the supposed backwardness of the Mediterranean, and to that I will now turn. So until now, this is a section that's called the structural unity of the Mediterranean. Until now, despite the deep structural unity of the Mediterranean, what does this mean? I'll tell you in a minute. Two important facts and their attendant deeply interconnected historical narratives have intervened to derail any effort to imagine the history of the modern Mediterranean as a whole. One is Islam, the second is colonialism. Indeed, both Islam and the colonial past continue to shape our perceptions of the modern histories of the Eastern and Southern Mediterranean, that is to say of Turkey, the Balkans, and the Arab Mediterranean, placing them, so to speak, in parenthesis, apart from the history of Northern and the Western Mediterranean. Misled by our present-day concerns about political Islam, we fail to recognize how recently the histories of Mediterranean societies have diverged, and we ascribe to cultural causes what are in fact the product of the political, economic, and communications transformations of the past 50 years. In this section, I want to try and persuade you that the broad contours of the Mediterranean's passage to modernity produced a series of patterned responses that resemble one another very deeply. All right, so what's a Mediterranean? During our period, the long 19th century we're at right now, the Mediterranean is buffeted by the same political and economic forces that the rest of the world is being exposed to. Indeed, it is getting full blast because it is, of course, on Europe's doorstep. And moreover, it is athwart the land route to India, which in the case of the British seems to bear some importance. So these changes were experienced differently by Mediterranean societies than by those of Northwestern Europe, or indeed by India and China. In the latter, that is to say in Northwestern Europe, after some initial difficulties, strong states and industrial economies were installed during the 19th century. Mediterranean societies were slower off the mark because delayed or muffled class formation was the rule, and local elites were bitterly divided over the necessity and aims of reform. Pause. All right, so if you know a little bit about the history of Spain in the 18th and 19th centuries, for example, or the history of Italy in the same period, without ever having to resort to the history of the Ottoman Empire, you will understand precisely what I'm talking about. So the effort to produce modern states is a kind of deer in the headlights moment. for the elites in Mediterranean countries in general, as they scramble about for ways in which they can bring about the changes that they know are necessary if they're going to continue to be able to compete with Northwestern European countries, without also simultaneously undoing the source of their own power. And that, of course, proved to be a bridge too far. They did not come up with an answer to that particular dilemma. All right, the same thing is true of what's going on in the economy. So by the late 18th century, Northwestern Europe is hitting its stride. The Atlantic world is now fully emerged as an important center of trade and commerce. Lots and lots of the resources of the Americas are being used in Britain and elsewhere in continental Europe to make up for shortfalls in their own societies. As a result, they are able to march from strength to strength. Mediterranean societies, by contrast, have a weaker relationship to the world capitalist system. They have state structures that are not able to institute laws that will be beneficial, for example, to furthering the advance of commerce and trade and property and all those other good things that need to happen if you're going to have a capitalist system. They also, because of the nature of their societies, they have, instead of separating, this is not necessarily a good thing if you think about the dark satanic mills, or indeed the social movements that it set off, but it is a fact that in the Mediterranean, class formation, as we would call it in political science land, is definitely muffled or delayed, and agrarian backwardness and the continued importance of pastoralists are the name of the game, right? So even Italy, even Spain are ones in which pastoralism, particularly the raising of sheep for wool, continues to be a very important source of energy and the occupation of large numbers of individuals, as well as the source of wealth of established elites. There's an institution in Spain called the Mesta, which is a kind of a great sheep drive from southern Spain to the north, where they are sold into northern Spanish markets and then commercialized throughout Europe. The wool is commercialized throughout Europe. So these kinds of institutions are established. Much the same kinds of thing have been noted for the Ottoman Empire. So I said there were 4 major agro-industrial complexes in the Mediterranean that were major sources of wealth and power. And 2 of them migrate outside. One is sugar, and the second one, a little bit later on, is cotton, both of which are important crops early on in the Mediterranean. The other 2 are silk and wool. And so the wool trade is the one that is very important to pastoralism, and it therefore helps to prop up pastoralism. If it did not result in a turn of phrase that I can't quite come up with, we could think of the persistence of the wool trade in the Mediterranean as being like a rust belt, right? So it's the sort of declining industries that are no longer really of any great need or importance, since wool is now produced in vast quantities, not just in Northern Europe, but all over the world. And it is able to be sent right away. So long and the short of it is the Mediterranean region experiences a lot of the same types of social formations, that is to say, the sort of social structures, as well as the same kinds of elites and the same kinds of oppositional groups, and the same kind of foci of conflict. All of these, so this is something that I'm arguing that Mediterranean societies have in common that differentiate them from your Northern European ones and from others in the other regions I've been comparing to. So despite lots of local variation, common patterns can be discerned in the responses of Mediterranean societies to the challenges of modernization. All right, so there we are. Now let's just try and look for some of these patterns. For most of humanity, and not just for Euro-humans, the global political frame has changed enormously over the last 5 centuries, particularly over the last 2.5 with the fossil fuel revolution. What did this transition mean for most people? What was the role of religion or other ethico-religious systems in sustaining and justifying the way things were? How did the way elites were legitimized fit into this system? How did the forces of what the late British historian Eric Hobsbawm called the dual revolution, which was the Industrial Revolution and the Democratic Revolution, affect the Mediterranean region as a whole over the course of the long 19th century? Again, this is this period from 1750 to 1914. Basically, it's the period of the Industrial Revolution. These changes were experienced differently by Mediterranean societies than by those in northwestern Europe. In the latter, after some initial difficulties, strong states and industrial economies were installed during the 19th century. Mediterranean societies, however, were a lot slower off the mark, and local elites became bitterly divided over the necessity and aims of reform. For example, if reform means that one has to secularize society and one has to begin to start out that work by, for example, seizing the lands that belong to the church, or in the case of the Ottoman Empire and Muslim societies of the Mediterranean, the Waqf lands, which have a similar kind of a role. These are sort of institutional structures that keep land and the revenues generated by land off the tax rolls, right? So if it means that, then Mediterranean elites, whether Muslim or Christian, would line up very much against the whole idea of secularizing. And that's just one of the problems that emerges. And so we'll begin to understand a little bit further along just where this takes us. Bottom line so far, though, is that despite local variations, it is possible to see these see some patterns here. So let's look, for instance, at the state-building process, which is the primary engine of political change throughout the Mediterranean in our period. Inspired by the successes of the Enlightenment French state, Spain, Italy, and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, as it was entitled, sought to introduce liberal reforms already by the 18th century. So too did the Ottoman Empire, albeit with minimal success, until the inauguration of the so-called Tanzimat reforms under the Sultan Mahmud II, who reigns from 1808 to 1839. So central to the reform package throughout the region, both in the Ottoman Empire and in these other countries that I've named, was the disestablishment of church control over land. Reformers all sought to dislodge older military and governmental elites who were rooted in patron clientage and to replace them with reforming elites characterized by efficiency, discipline, and laissez-faire, little education too. To this end, they modernized fiscal systems, importing wholesale a lot of the fiscal changes that had been introduced in France already starting in the 18th century. Liberal bureaucrats adopted policies that expanded the ability of the state to organize and control its citizens and thereby to govern more efficiently. They oversaw the financing and construction of railroads, telegraph lines, and other means of communication, as well as the development of modern publicly supported secondary and tertiary schools. Primary education throughout the Mediterranean region is largely left in the hands of the church. Over the course of the long 19th century, fundamental changes occurred. So old political classes declined, new ones emerged, and elite politics throughout the region is transformed completely. So you can catch some of this in Il Gattopardo, The Leopard, a famous Italian novel set in Sicily that talks about just exactly how these changes are being experienced. As modern states emerge along the northern shore of the Mediterranean, these societies develop new, more efficient, and more intrusive fiscal systems. So now it's not just the state and the structures and how they're getting revenues from land, but more and more now we're talking about really intrusive fiscal systems, including, income tax. All right, so as modern states, sorry, in this particular period, it may be a sore toe for some of you, but we do have to mention it. All right, so as modern states emerge along the northern, we did that. All right, so as a result of these new systems of fiscality, collisions occur between the old agrarian elites and the established religious elites with the new up-and-coming modern reformers. All right, so the old elites and the religious elites are very much linked to on the one hand, the dominance of the church, of religion, and so whether we're talking about the Catholic parts of the Mediterranean or we're talking about the Orthodox or indeed the Muslim, pretty much the same kind of dynamic is in play. So the Ottoman case in this history is just different in degree. It's not really different in kind at all. Ottoman state builders or would-be state builders are no less jealous of their power and no less eager to demolish the entrenched interests. And by the latter part of the 19th century, they had already accomplished quite a bit. So the Ottoman reform process, which, as I said, is called the Tanzimat, literally the reordering, provoked a collision between reform-minded state bureaucrats and local elites eager to defend their traditional rights and liberties. It also stimulated conflict with peasants and artisans for whom the encroachment of the state was experienced primarily in the form of military conscription on the one hand and increased taxation on the other. So while part of the Ottoman Empire, Egypt and Tunisia had their own quasi-autonomous state-building programs, which, if anything, were even more far-reaching than what the Ottomans had. Right? So there's multiple different experiments are going on. Incorporation into the world economy, the second type of change, fostered the emergence of a new urban middle class whose fortunes were linked to Northern European elites. So it also fostered the emergence of an urban-based class of landowners engaged in commercial agriculture for export. So previously, agriculture had been a kind of sign of wealth. It wasn't, landlords, people who owned large quantities of land were mostly aristocrats, and they tended to bask in the lifestyle that afforded, and they were not so much interested in commercial agriculture, although this too, even for them, or some of them, did begin to change in the course of the 19th century. So peasants and artisans are sort of totally exposed in these changing economic ties. So to the fiscal and other pressures of the centralizing state, therefore, we have to add additional ones based on the incorporation of the region into the capitalist world market. As with the enactment of state reforms, it's possible to detect the presence of semi-colonial patterns in the economic histories of the various souths of the European Mediterranean. So here I'm referring to Andalusia, parts of southern France, Languedoc, Corsica, the Mezzogiorno, southern parts of Italy, Sicily, much of Greece. These are all, they pretty much look like the Middle East in this period, or agricultural sections of the Middle East. A third dynamic of the 19th century is the communications revolution. So, and in contrast to what happened in the 16th century, which had rendered the Mediterranean increasingly peripheral to the new North Atlantic-centered world economy, the introduction of the railroad, the steamship lines, regular steamship service between the Middle East and Europe dates from the 1840s, and the telegraph. London is linked to India as early as 1857. Indeed, possibly apocryphally, it is said that the very first message that was sent from India to London on this telegraph is a message saying, "Oh my God, they're mutinying!" And this is in 1857, and that was the Great Indian Mutiny. And then the line is cut. So anyway, so because of these communications revolutions, the position of the Mediterranean in the circuits of global exchange are transformed. Here, the role of French Saint-Simonian technocrats, what's a Saint-Simonian? Where is Jonathan Beecher now that you need him? So Saint-Simonians are sometimes called utopian socialists, although actually that's just a phase when there are adolescents and having hijinks and dashing about wearing weird costumes. Because later on, they all grew up to be bankers and builders of telegraph lines and so on. Indeed, some of them were behind the Crédit Mobilier, which funded the American Transcontinental Railroad. All right, so that's who the Saint-Simonians are. They thought in a very big way, not just about Europe. They built much of the railroads of Europe. They built major dams in the Danube and elsewhere. They also built the Suez Canal. All right, so, and the Panama Canal was a Saint-Simonian project as well. Right, so this is already in the mid-19th century. So the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 brings the largest transformation of the place of the Mediterranean in the world economy. So now everybody has to go through the Mediterranean again. It's so much faster than going around Africa. How could we have gone around Africa all these years? Now that we know we have a Suez Canal, there's no brainer, etc. So as a result of these changes, shipping times between Europe and the markets in Asia are drastically reduced. And with the telegraph line, now you can say, wait a minute, the market's going down, don't send, and you could get almost instantaneous response. So a lot of the patterns that we're used to now, albeit our world is so much faster still, were already present with this communication revolution of the 19th century. Regular steamship transport linked the Mediterranean region to the Atlantic world and facilitated large-scale migrations of people to North America, South America, and Australasia. Some of you may have forebears that actually experienced this migration. So the communications revolution then partially reverses the changes of the 16th century. It makes the Mediterranean more central than it had been for quite some time, both economically and also in its importance to global strategists. Okay, so we're entering the winding down here, although we still have a little bit to go. And the next section is called Struggles Over the Reform Project. So all of these changes are going on, and some of them are very far-reaching indeed, although often they have very quixotic kinds of impacts, and it's not, there is no sort of straightforward sort of progressive narrative that you can draw. It's a sort of a newly empowered capitalist class that is going from strength to strength, nor is there a working class movement that is feisty and able to begin to lay down some terms. Neither of these things are really characteristic of the Mediterranean. However, this does not mean there was not a lot of struggle over the reform project. So where the experience of the Middle East diverges from that of Europe, Northern Europe anyway, and where it joins the rest of the Third World is in the colonial context of its coming to modern politics. The establishment of European hegemony challenges basic cultural values, even as it distorts the impact of change in significant ways, and sets in motion deeply rooted responses throughout the region. So in this section, I'm going to talk about how this played itself out. All right, so the onset of modernity in its different manifestations provokes a series of bitter struggles along what I'm going to call the cultural fault lines of the Mediterranean region. If we look at the patterns from a distance, and over the long term, we can see that all groups are split, and the lines of cleavage are continually reshaped even as they persist. So elites, the church, workers, peasants are all affected, the rising bourgeoisie as well. Struggles center around three main areas: struggles around the place of religion in the state, struggles around gender, especially sexuality and the public role of women, the place of women in the public square, and finally, and of course crucially, the land question. And the land question is the one that sets in motion the inquiry that led to Eric Hobsbawm to write this wonderful book called Primitive Rebels, which is about what peasants do when they get provoked and they don't have the heroic working class movement to lead their way. All right, so it's crucial to understand that these struggles and the cleavages they provoke and lay bare, beyond their complex local characteristics, come from some common sources. So I'm back to my theme of there's some commonalities here. Even though we think that the Middle East or the Ottoman Empire and the Mediterranean European countries are different, all these struggles are really very much of alike. Indeed, the people move about, and so sometimes they're both at the level of the investor class and also at the level of the working class. You have Italian and Greek and others showing up in Cairo and Alexandria and elsewhere seeking work, as well as you have major bankers and financiers and people looking to get in on a good investment opportunity showing up back and forth across the region. So in the 19th century, the place of religion becomes something that is a major focal point of struggle. Not that in some ways it's not that it's over now, right? So in ways that could come out in the question period. So religious complexity was and continues to be an important organizing feature throughout the region, regardless of confessional adherence. So in other words, regardless of whether we're talking Christians, Jews, Muslims, whoever. Religion, indeed, has provided the framework for the grinding of these cultural tectonic plates up to the present. And to some extent, Brodel already had spotted this back in the 16th century, writing about the 16th century. The place of religion as a marker of identity in the 19th century is further strengthened by colonialism. Indeed, despite the claims of linguistic nationalisms, for example, Turkish and Greek, to have supplanted religion as the core of identity, religion remains central to the underpinning of even these national projects. This was much more obscure 5 years ago when I wrote this sentence than it is now, when all that has been going on in modern Turkey since the Gezi riots this past summer is all about religion, the resurgence of religion as a crucially important element in the politics of Turkey, which otherwise, in some ways, utterly perversely, it now appears, had been among the most militantly Voltairean in its insistence that religion had to be crushed. So the importance of secularism in defining the modern identity of Turkey really needs to be underscored and sort of pulled out here so that we can understand that it was not always the case that Islam was the obvious and only source of identity. Quite the contrary, indeed. So by the end of by World War I, Eastern Mediterranean cities all across the region are unable to escape the drift towards polarization along religious lines. So the fate of Thessaloniki is in this case emblematic of the broader situation. So why do I invoke this city, whose name may not have been known to you previously, but Salonika, you can find out a lot about in a wonderful book by Mark Massauer called Salonika, City of Ghosts. And it is the city to which many, many of the Ladino-speaking Spanish Jews went at the invitation of Sultan Suleiman in the 16th century after they were expelled from Spain. Right, so and they do not, alas, survive the drift to war, and particularly by the end of World War II, this community is largely extinguished. But they're not the only ones. So one of the perverse things about thinking in bigger ways about the role of religion in the Mediterranean is if we want to start our clock in, say, 1492. Now there's a date for you. One of the things we realize is it's not just when Columbus sails the ocean blue, but it's also simultaneously the moment in which the Jews are expelled. So the Edict of Expulsion is something that comes the following March, in which the Jews of Spain are ordered by the crowned heads to sell up their lands and properties and to leave the national territory of Spain. And while some of them managed to hang around for a bit, and the Inquisition was devised as a cruel way of making sure that they got the message, others quickly went elsewhere. Some of them went to Portugal, some of them went to the incipient Spanish-American Empire, others went to Northern Europe, to Eastern Europe, and a good chunk of them went to the Muslim lands of the Mediterranean, and in particular to Salonika. All right, so 19th century reforms are not just about religion, they are also about other things. But the religious struggle is one that plays itself out in still other dimensions. So the one that I wanted to pull out here to discuss is the struggle between clerical and anti-clerical interests in these different countries. So again, if you have a little background knowledge, you may want to reflect back on the Spanish Civil War and the massive struggles that went on between the anarchist communist side, the left, so to speak, on the one hand, and the fascist, the Falange, General Franco on the other. So anti-clericism came naturally to those on the left in this time period, not just in Spain, in Italy as well, in France indeed, where it continues to be a sore toe in ways that have moved around a bit, but it's still a vitally important dimension of what lies beneath the froth of the daily politics of France. Much the same kind of cultural confrontation forms a leitmotif in the deep structural history of modern Turkey. So this is what I was alluding to a minute ago. The bureaucrats of the Tanzimat, no less than their compadres in Spain, France, and Italy, saw in priestcraft the enemy of all reform. and thus they gave it no quarter. At opposite ends of the Mediterranean, popular anti-clerical passions spilled over in attacks on the one hand against Spanish convents and on the other against Turkish Sufi lodges. So this is going on in the 1930s in both countries. So like the return of the repressed, Islamist groups now terrify the holders of power all around the rim of the Mediterranean in the name of populist virtue and justice. As I have suggested elsewhere, the torments of contemporary Algeria must be seen in the context of a Jacobin French colonial state that all too efficiently demolished the central institutions of Algerian Islam. Elsewhere in the 19th century, the reform project was appropriated by certain groups to be used against others. Those having privileged ties to the state or to the emerging state, the Egyptian state, for example, or to European business interests were often in a position to profit disproportionately. What else has changed? While urban artisans and rural agriculturalists found themselves squeezed from all sides. Following the establishment of European political control, that is to say of colonialism, red in tooth and claw, groups willing to serve as intermediaries gained substantially, while overt opponents suffered from various forms of political and economic discrimination, if not indeed worse. The complex sequence of these changes sets in motion powerful forces that intersect with one another, eroding old established interests and remolding new ones. Social protest and resistance finds fertile ground in the circumstances thus created. So in the cities of the Mediterranean, there are all sorts of nooks and crannies in the emerging new order. And while they display astonishing resilience in the face of dramatic change, they also prove, in the end, incapable of withstanding the convulsive collapse of the old order at the end of World War I. So I'd like to conclude with a few questions. So one of the questions which I asked at the beginning is, how much did colonialism matter? Why did parts of the Mediterranean colonized, and why were parts colonized, and why were others colonizers? One way to evaluate the impact of Western dominance upon Middle Eastern societies is in their impact on internal processes of political change, where collaboration with imperialism worked to undermine the legitimacy of local elites, even as it strengthened their power. Okay, pause. Let's recall for a second that in the Ottoman Empire, in Tunisia, and in Egypt, at a minimum, all the modern reform project is introduced by the state. It is the Ottoman state that introduces these changes. It is not the IMF, it is not faceless European bureaucrats. It is actually leaders themselves and their elites, the elites who supported the changes in any event, who take the primary role in bringing this about. So how is this analytically in any way distinct from what goes on in France, or what goes on in Germany, or what goes on in Spain or Italy? So you have elites that are Britain. Maybe we should leave aside because I'm talking about the French reforms here, but the Spanish and Italian ones are importing the French reforms as well, and it's their own indigenous elites and the reformers who are all excited about what France is doing and how we have to get some of this magic ourselves. That's what's going on in the Ottoman Empire. It's what goes on in Tunisia. It's what's going on in Egypt. So how is this colonization? Well, if so, then Europe is colonizing itself. France itself is colonizing regions that don't even speak French, that are part of France, right? So this looks like colonialism. Is it not colonialism? How do we think about it analytically as historians or as social scientists? So in this kind of an ambiguous context, the national struggle eventually, as it gathers in coherence, tends to take precedence over the class struggle. Thus, European dominance shores up the precarious positions of old elites, while it successfully capitalizes upon their position to be able to maintain control of the nationalist movement, and thus ensures that when new classes made their long-deferred emergence on the political scene, which they do after World War I, and even more powerfully after World War II, their impact would be muffled. So this is the era that has now drawn to a close. This is what the Arab Spring is about. It's the end of the playing out of all the iterations of what I just described. So let's go back to our question. So what is colonialism? Those who want to make the litmus test be the incorporation into the world market, here's another way of thinking about it, have a hard time distinguishing between the impact of marketization on Cornwall, say, a sub-region of Britain, and that of Egypt. For the same processes are at play in both arenas. So is colonialism then the deindustrializing of sections of Cornwall and of Egypt? Is that something that we are to understand as being colonialism? But that doesn't seem to make any sense. Or is colonialism consist in the adoption of 19th century state reform project? Well, we already dismissed that because the French political model of organization and state building are adopted freely by rulers as well as imposed by bayonets, right? And imposed by bayonets on whom? Well, we could say Algeria, you might want to go with that one to start with, but you could also say Italy and Spain, because that's what Napoleon does. It's all about imposing the French reforms on Italy and Spain. So colonialism as being a project of political domination for the purpose of the spread of reform doesn't seem to take us anywhere either. However, this does seem to be what Timothy Mitchell, political scientist, has in mind when he names his book Colonizing Egypt. But it's not about colonizing Egypt. Or at least from the point of view of somebody who spent a lot of time thinking about colonial Algeria and Israel, and Morocco and Tunisia and Libya, other examples of settler colonialism, I want to reserve the term colonization for settler colonialism. That is to say, the appropriation of land from indigenous peoples by foreigners. When European settlers dispossess local agriculturalists, that is something altogether different from when you are being marketized and forced to dance to a particular tune in an Egyptian village by your leader, who is somebody who is a native and who he and his family have lived there forever, right? So if economic colonization, that is to say, the turning of Egypt into an economic platform for the export of cotton to the world market, if that is colonialism, then why is not the same thing, why can't we talk about economic incorporation as being colonialism all over the world? Again, I don't understand the logic. Maybe this is testimony to the backwardness of Middle East studies, that could be. So this is manifestly not the case in Egypt, nor is it the case of the Ottoman Empire. Anyway, what is colonialism? That can be a question that we can have a lot of fun thinking about, but I think analytically, it's just been fudged over. All kinds of stuff gets to be colonialism. Colonialism is a boo word. Oh my God, you're a colonialist. Ew. Can I play with you? Ooh, why would I want to do that? So colonialism turns into something that we can sort of a label we can easily attach without having any understanding of actually what is going on beneath the surface. Okay, so let me just wind up. So where the experience of the Middle East diverges from that of Europe and joins the rest of the Third World is exactly in this colonial context. So European hegemony challenges their cultural values. Let's go back and think about that for a minute. So what it means is that policies are being introduced. Let's just stay with settler colonies for a minute. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Israel, Palestine. And what we have is people are telling locals what to do. And the people who are doing the telling don't speak the local language. And so they just say, put this on that. That's the way you get people to put fertilizer on the field, for example. An example actually that was witnessed by a colleague of mine named John Waterbury in the case of Morocco. Literally, that was what the economic reform program was about. All right, so if it's just bossing people around and doing so in a language that they don't speak, and being part of systems of accountability that stop at the local level, in which no local has any input, that we can call colonialism, I think, right? Because if you're in the Limousin or some backward region in Italy and people are being bossed around, if you're in the Mezzogiorno, or if you're in Calabria, and people are talking to you in a language you don't speak, Italian, then you might want to get riled up too. But is that colonialism? What are the structures of accountability? I mean, there's some things to think about here if we're trying to just try and figure out a way to use this word. European dominance then is something that surfs on the back of these kinds of changes and is able to capitalize upon them for a period. But in the end, there is a kind of a cultural blowback. This is now I'm groping towards. Why did things end in 1914? Right? Somebody may pick up a question on that, because I'm saying that basically this whole system of reform and incorporation into the world economy and so on comes to an end more or less with World War I, certainly manifestly by the 1930s, all across the Middle Eastern region, and certainly by this time elsewhere as well. Pause. Still, there are some comparable things going on. In the old days, we used to want to sort of think about Ataturk as being this wonderful modern Turk because he was secularist. Oh boy, and he's modern and he's European and he wants to put the clocks on European time. And that all looks great. But the longer the distance, the bigger the distance that we have from the days of Ataturk and the transformation of the Ottoman Empire and the end of the role of religion, the abolition of the caliphate and the sultanate and all that stuff, the more he looks like Mussolini. So you can say that fascisms, plural, are one of the consequences of this navigating this transition in the 1930s. And I don't think that is over. So anyway, thank you so much. And if you have questions, I'd be delighted to entertain them. And so I have to say, as the lights come up, that you've been wonderful, and thank you so much for your patience. I know it's difficult to hear spoken some kind of history that isn't really about kings and princes or about some nitty-gritty little thing that you can sort of worry to death. This is another way of thinking, and I think these framing questions are at least as important in the way in which we think historically about what's going on. Pause. Consider the fate of Ukraine. Right, so there are mics that are on both sides here, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and somebody will sprint right there to you with the mic. The reason I've been standing here, rooted to my spot, is because this thing is being videotaped, and so we are all prisoners of technology. So, questions, anybody? Yeah.
In the beginning of your lecture, and thank you for all of that history that my brain could not completely contain, but will continue to study. In the beginning of your lecture, you goes, "What went wrong? Islam." Was that to wake us up? Was that tongue-in-cheek? I don't know, because it didn't connect with the rest of that. Could you explain, please?
Right, good. All right, so thank you for pulling that up. And yes, of course, it's to see if you're awake. But it also had a more serious purpose because for so long, I mean, at least in the media, I'm understanding, if you're in this room, probably you follow the news and you are trying to make historical connections and that's all wonderful. But the media itself, this sort of beast that's running around eating its tail at every moment, is trying to get us to think in ways that you can summarize in a 5-second spot. And so, what's wrong? Islam. Okay, fine. Next, we'll talk to somebody else about something else, right? So, that was a mischievous answer, possibly provoked by the publicist of Bernard Lewis, who wrote a book under that title, and maybe was not getting quite the provocative thing from him that he wanted to get. And so the answer is Islam, and that was timed to the American intervention in Iraq. So it came out right as 9/11 is happening. And it had a devastating impact on the ability of Americans to think historically. So it's like wipes the circuits clean, and suddenly we're in a history land. We used to be in history land. We used to understand that things that happen now are connected to things that happened before and that might be happening later. And it pays to stay in touch, right, and try and understand. But if there is a cultural one-word answer, oh, well, it's simple. And so, so the lurchings about in the Middle East and the 7, 10, how many $1 trillion that have been expended in a bootless and fruitless effort, in my humble opinion, have come about because the American public has not been willing to try and get beyond these one-word answers. And that's a shame, and that's our shame. Yeah. Sharon Kinoshita.
Hi, Terry. Thank you. You mentioned the 4 agro complexes of the Mediterranean, and you talked about sugar and cotton migrating to the New World, and you talked about wool being pervasive throughout the Mediterranean. You didn't say a word about silk, so can you give us a word?
All right. So the quick and dirty on silk is that silk is something that for a long time the Chinese had the monopoly of, and then, so legend has it, some Byzantine emperor figured out some way to smuggle silkworms and the mulberry leaves that they feed upon inside of a bamboo staff all the way across the Silk Road, all the way to the Byzantine Empire. And by some process of alchemy that I don't understand, somehow the leaves were still edible and the worms were still eating, and so silk in the Mediterranean was born as an industry. And then it migrated around. Part of the power of the Ottomans, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but part of the economic power that the Ottomans built out of was that they had a very important silk center in Bursa. Italy becomes very heavily involved in the silk trade. Silk becomes also an important commodity that's produced in Spain as well as and more memorably perhaps in France. So silk is something that is definitely a Mediterranean thing. But with the change in the topology of global exchange, to use big words, it means that now Europeans can get silk direct from China and sail around the world, and it's a lot cheaper, and it's produced better, and you can actually commission the weavers in China to produce tablecloths for Britain, right? According to patterns that are provided. So the silk business continues, but it's much slower. It's a different kind of a technology. It's not so easily machinable. That's one of the things that silk as a technology has going for it. But it survives, but it doesn't thrive at all. And also, once cotton comes, silk gets totally outrun. So if you can get fancy Dan Indian cottons for 10% of the price of a silk gown, and you can show up in court and nobody knows the difference, right? So something's going on here. So that's the story. But before I let Sharon go away, so one of the things I wanted to say, and this room is thickly populated with people that I have talked to and learned a huge amount from over the years, is that I'm somebody who has always thought that thinking was a social act. And one of the things I always like to do is organize people having conversations about things that wouldn't ordinarily talk to one another. And so Sharon, who is in literature, and I began some years ago, more like 8 or 10, maybe more like 10, to have a fledgling Mediterranean studies group here on campus, which then took off and became utterly famous once Brian Catlas arrived here. And Brian is now alas departed, but this has become a really major center of Mediterranean studies in the medieval and early modern periods. And so this campus, it's due to Sharon and due to Brian that we have this on our campus. I also want to mention the Comparative International Studies group. Again, there's some people in the room that I was certainly very much involved with back at the beginnings of the campus, when there were no structures in place, there was no money for any kind of reading groups or anything else. If you wanted a reading group, start reading. So we evolved a system initially sort of somewhat tentatively. This is for the benefit of those who are about to be defunded and who are junior faculty, perhaps. You can survive without a grant, turns out. And so what you do is you read each other's work, and you move around from somebody's living room to somebody else's, so nobody controls the game. And whoever's giving the paper brings the beer. Simple as that. So those of you who are part of that shared set of memories, thank you. So somebody else. Yeah.
Hi, my question is regarding the Arab Spring. If I understood you correctly, you propose that this movement are trying to move the societies from Islam to society that is not so reliant on religion. Under that vision, I could say that only Tunisia is being successful, and I just wonder. I have had a first-hand experience with the process in Egypt. It doesn't look to me that it's going in that direction at all, and I don't know whether you think that more time is needed, so that they become successful in that way, or maybe another competing mechanism?
So listen, I mean, you know, we don't have the time now to really get anywhere like to the bottom of that question. Let me scratch the surface a little bit, because I have a perspective, and maybe you share it, maybe you don't. Maybe it'll be of use to others. But I regard all of this nonsense in the media-created thing about Twitter and the Arab Spring and so on as being a bunch of nonsense, right? And it's a bunch of nonsense that the United States tried to play somewhat against its own heart to some clever end, such as bringing quote-unquote democracy. Well, they never wanted democracy. They always wanted to keep Mubarak. They wanted to keep all of these guys. So they wanted to bring a simulacra of democracy. Well, they already had a simulacra of democracy. It wasn't working. That's why people were rebelling. Plus, the societies are being devastated by the IMF and being made to march to the drum of the world economy. And there's no work, right? And so it's desperate. And you've got large numbers of people. I mean, the demographics are important, but they're not the main or only driver, I think. But it's something like 50% of many societies, world societies, not just in the Middle East, are made up of people under the age of 25 who have no future, right? So I used to be able to say that with more confidence in a room full of Americans, as if somehow this did not apply. I'm not quite sure I can say that in quite the same conviction as I used to. And let me add just one final thing, which is that, one way of understanding what's going on in Egypt or Iraq or Bahrain, or just pick your favorite place, I mean, there's so many manifestations of this, is that the United States early in the Cold War made a pact with Saudi Arabia. And the pact was that the Saudis would fund stuff that we needed to have funded. And so one of the beneficiaries of this is the so-called Mujahideen movement in Afghanistan, of whom the great success story is that of Osama bin Laden, right? So we created this monster, right? And the Saudis, not to their credit, invested heavily, not just in sending material and supporting people in Afghanistan and elsewhere, but in turning into a state project the spread and diffusion of their own twisted version of Islam, which is called Wahhabi Islam, and in addition to concocting a story that Sunnis and Shiites hate each other, which is manifestly not the case, except possibly in the benighted lands of the Arabian Peninsula, where even there it is highly suspect, because large numbers of Saudis are in fact Shiite, as are Bahrainis, as are Qataris, and so on. So the Shiites are a minority even in the Arabian Peninsula, and they're not particularly interested in Iran. They're interested in surviving and keeping their heads above water and avoiding getting stereotyped. So this has become a kind of you reach for historical analogies, and none of them really quite work. One that I've been using, but I don't think I fully am behind, is the Spanish Civil War, in which only you got to flip the modality so that it's the right that's in the ascendancy, it's the right project that's the important one, and so the Saudis and others from the peninsula, and alas the Turks now to their eternal regret and shame, have been conniving in a global jihad against Syria. Right. So you read about somehow the rebels in Syria and the free Syrian forces and all the rest of that. It may have had some meaning in the first couple of years of the struggle, but now what we have is an effort by foreign powers to defeat a government in power and to impose this Saudi version of Islam. And they murder everybody. Most Saudis, most Sunnis, this seems now to be more and more seeming to be an accurate statement, actually support the Hafiz al-Assad, the Bashar al-Assad regime, right? So Syria, there's no end to the ability of the United States to confuse people by continuing to hold out the possibility that there is some kind of democratic secular force that is at work. There is no such force. And we are supporting, we and our Saudi and alas even Israeli allies are busy supporting, right now, Al-Qaeda. That's who, we've come full circle. When did we ever stop supporting Al-Qaeda? This brings the question. I won't answer that one. Somebody else? Yeah.
So in the first beautiful...
Hang on.
In that first beautiful image, satellite image that you showed of the Middle East, the difference that comes out to me between the different parts of that region is the availability of water, and the associated availability of arable land. So I'm just curious from your long-term historical perspective. Well, first of all, just how that plays into your narrative of the factors creating differences and separateness, but also whether there's a point in time where that begins to be more of an issue, whether it, was not 2,000 years ago, or, I don't know how the landscape has evolved to know whether it used to not be such a difference or not.
Well, I mean, so here we just have to look outside our door, look in Santa Cruz County to have an understanding about what's going on with water. And, so it's pretty desperate here. Imagine what it would be in semi-arid places like much of the Middle East and the Mediterranean, right? So it's if you look at these maps that have been developed that project forward what the average mean temperature is going to be in various parts of the world, the Mediterranean is really screwed. Right, so it's going to get, 30 degrees centigrade is now an average summer temperature. What is that? It's like 100 and something. And 98, I can't do the math in my head right now, but it's, anyway, and on up into the 120s, numbers that were never seen, for I don't know how long you'd have to go back to see such a number. So places like Morocco, which is pretty much like California minus the Sierra water, is in desperate shape right now. Places like Iran, this has been now published fairly widely, at least online, if not other places. Entire lakes are drying up, but this is true not just of Iran, it's true of all across the region. The waters of the Euphrates, no more than the waters of the Colorado River, reach the mouths of those rivers and have not for some time. Right, so, and the implications of that are very, 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 very striking. So, one alternative way of playing the whole Syria business is to say it begins with a catastrophic series of crop failures as a result of global warming, right? And that's something that we can look forward to, right? So it's the way in which rising temperatures are going to destabilize all sorts of societies, and other societies will be willing to jump in and take advantage temporarily while they can, right? So it's a complex story, but it's a Middle Easterners were pioneers in the development of technologies around water and water conservation, water transportation, and so on. A lot of that knowledge has moved around the world, and particularly once the Spanish conquered the empires they did, those technologies are found from the Philippines to Mexico to Peru to wherever, and they're all technologies that originate in the Iranian plateau. Right, so it's amazing how the water works phenomenon has just sort of played its way out in a global fashion. Technologies are not culturally bound, and mostly you don't even have to have an example of it. You're just going to have the idea in your head. Oh, back over there, they used to have this way of doing something, and then we'll fiddle around and we can figure out how to do it. Okay. I think we just ran out of gas here. Thank you so much.